Bill Gaither has spent 60 years building something extraordinary in Christian music. And in that time, he has talked openly, sometimes with joy, sometimes with a quiet grief, about the singers who passed through the Gaither Vocal Band. He has spoken about the ones he wished had stayed longer. He has spoken about the departures that cost him more than people knew. But there is one conversation he has carried differently from all the others. One addition to the band that he has never been able to discuss without a particular pause, a weight in his voice that the people who have followed this ministry for decades recognize immediately. At 82, the things Bill Gaither has left unsaid have started to say themselves. Those who have spent time around him in recent years, who have sat in the rooms where he reflects on what he built and what it cost, confirm that one chapter of the Gaither Vocal Band's history comes back to him in a way that goes beyond professional reflection, beyond the gratitude for the gift, beyond the standard grief of watching something good fall apart. Stay with us through this video, because what comes into full view at the 10-minute mark is something the gospel community has understood privately for years, and nobody with a real platform has been willing to put into words until now. Bill Gaither's place in gospel music history needs no introduction to the people who have made the homecoming videos part of their lives. But it's worth saying plainly for anyone who's finding his story for the first time. Born in Alexandria, Indiana in 1936, Bill wrote the songs that became the soundtrack of faith for multiple generations. He touched me, because he lives. The King is coming. Melodies sung in church sanctuaries and at kitchen tables and at the bedsides of people who needed something to hold on to in the dark. The Gaither Vocal Band itself came together in its first form in the early 1980s, a vehicle for Bill's harmonies and songwriting that grew, over time, into something much larger than anyone had mapped out. And then, in 1991, Bill launched the Homecoming Gatherings, a reunion of older gospel voices initially captured on video almost by accident. And that first recording became a phenomenon that nobody in Southern gospel music had anticipated. For millions of fans who discovered those tapes through the 90s and early 2000s, the Homecoming wasn't simply a concert series. Christian music, the whole living tradition of faith expressed through voices in harmony, found a home there. And the Gaither Vocal Band was at the center of all of it. Those videos weren't entertainment in the way that word usually gets used. They were something closer to community for people who watched them. For the audience that grew up passing those tapes from family member to family member, the faces on screen weren't performers at a remove. They were part of the spiritual furniture of life, and the things those artists sang about mapped onto the things those viewers actually experienced. That kind of connection, built over decades of recordings and homecoming gatherings, is not the kind of thing that resolves cleanly when something goes wrong. And that's why what happened in 1994 still lives inside this story the way it does. The Gaither Vocal Band has cycled through some of the most gifted voices in the history of contemporary Christian music. David Phelps brought a tenor instrument of operatic scope that stopped rooms cold the first time audiences heard it. Guy Penrod carried a rougher, warmer edge that connected with listeners raised on country gospel, a kind of directness that didn't require distance between the song and the singer. Wes Hampton brought a steadiness that balanced out the band's more dramatic personalities, a presence that anchored the harmonies without ever pulling attention away from the lyric. Mark Lowry brought something harder to categorize, a comedian's gift for the truth, a willingness to ask the questions that devotional music usually leaves politely unasked, an honesty that made people laugh and cry in the same breath, and then wonder how both things had happened at once. And then, in the late 1980s, Michael English joined the Gaither Vocal Band, and the whole center of gravity shifted. Michael's voice was one of those genuinely rare instruments, a tenor with effortless upper range and an emotional directness that made other singers pay attention when he opened his mouth. Bill Gaither recognized it the moment he heard it, And he did what Bill does with gifts he recognizes. He gave Michael every resource the organization had. By 1994, Michael English stood at the top of the Gospel Music Association's annual rankings, holding the Artist of the Year award, the highest individual honor in the industry. That ascent had taken less than a decade, which tells you everything about the velocity of what Bill had set in motion. Those were years of real momentum for the whole Gaither project. The homecoming gatherings were drawing together the legends of Southern gospel alongside newer voices, and Michael's presence gave the recordings a contemporary energy that reached audiences who might otherwise never have found their way to that music. Dove Award nominations were arriving. The visibility was expanding. From every external angle, the story looked like what success is supposed to look like a gift recognized early and given room to become what it was always going to be. But here's the thing. What Bill Gaither has said in the years since, in interviews where his voice drops slightly when Michael's name enters the conversation, carries a grief alongside the gratitude that rewards careful attention. Not the grief of disappointment in another person's talent, a different kind. The kind that belongs to someone who gave everything he had and watched it go sideways in a way he didn't see coming. And at the 5-minute mark of this story, we're only at the beginning of what that grief actually contained. Because what Bill said in one particular interview, and what Gloria confirmed separately in her own writing, is the part of this that gospel media has almost entirely passed over. Michael English resigned from the Gaither organization in 1994. In that same year, he collected the Artist of the Year award. The departure had nothing to do with musical direction and nothing to do with creative differences. An extramarital affair had become public, and Michael stepped away from the ministry rather than let the story consume it from the inside. What followed were years that nobody connected to this story has described as anything other than difficult. Reports of substance abuse, extended periods where Michael disappeared from gospel music almost entirely, a personal life that had come apart at exactly the moment his professional life should have been opening up into something even larger. Bill Gaither never publicly condemned Michael English, and that fact carries more weight than it might appear to on the surface. It tells you what kind of man Bill is, and it tells you what kind of ministry he believed he was running. Condemnation was never the language of the homecoming world. That wasn't the theology Bill and Gloria had built their life's work around. But those who have followed this story across decades know that a difference exists, and it's not a small one, between the warmth in Bill's voice when he discusses singers who left on their own terms, and the particular quietness that arrives when he discusses the circumstances surrounding certain other departures. That quietness held for 30 years. And what it contained is where this story turns into something nobody in his immediate circle was prepared to address publicly. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. When Michael English returned to gospel music, his reconciliation with the Gaither organization was not a quiet or administrative matter. It was documented, visible, and for the fans who had loved Michael's voice and grieved what happened to him, it carried an emotional charge that few moments in the entire homecoming history have matched. Bill Gaither extended that welcome publicly and without apparent reservation, and Michael recorded again, performed again on the homecoming stages, and found his way back to the music that had defined the best years of his earlier life. None of that welcome was performance. Anyone who has watched Bill Gaither discuss Michael English across the span of recorded interviews understands that the affection running through those conversations is genuine, the grief is genuine, and the two have always existed together, not in resolution, but in the complicated way that real relationships between real people actually hold together across the long distance of difficult years. What Bill has reflected on, and this is the piece that the Dove Award coverage and the Gospel Music Association retrospectives have consistently left out, is the structural question living underneath the personal one. The Gaither Vocal Band, at its strongest, was carrying more weight than a musical act typically carries. people brought their hardest seasons to those recordings. They played "I Bowed on My Knees and Cried Holy" at funerals. They listened to "Satisfied" in hospital waiting rooms, in the middle of personal losses that required something more substantial than comfort. The voices on those recordings weren't separate from the faith those voices were supposed to represent. For a substantial portion of the audience, they were the same thing, and that sameness was precisely the point. When someone at the center of that kind of ministry breaks in a visible and public way, the fracture doesn't stay personal. It moves outward into all the places where that person's voice had been carrying something for somebody else, into all the living rooms and car trips and bedside moments where a particular song had come to mean something specific. And Bill Gaither said, in a moment captured in a longer interview that received far less attention than it deserved, that you wonder, when something like that happens, whether you gave someone a platform before they were ready for it. Those words weren't accusation. They arrived as the reflection of a man who had spent years asking what part, if any, his own judgment had played in what followed, and who had found, after 30 years of sitting with the question, that it didn't fully resolve. Gloria Gaither has written about the distance that can exist between a person's gifting and their character, and the way that distance becomes its own kind of trouble when the gift is placed in front of a large audience before the character has had time to catch up. Mark Lowry, who has always been the member of the Gaither family most willing to speak plainly about the things that cost something, has acknowledged in separate interviews that Michael's departure left a wound across the entire organization, one that didn't follow any clean narrative of fault or innocence, but settled instead into the complicated middle territory that real human failure always occupies. The territory where most of the actual stories live. The fans who loved Michael English's voice, who still pull up recordings of him singing on those homecoming stages, have never fully arrived at a settled feeling about what happened. The grief softened across the years. Michael's return to gospel music, his reconciliation with the Gaither world, the performances that followed, all of it provided a kind of resolution. But the original Mark remained, and Bill Gaither has carried a portion of it in the honest, unresolved way that good leaders carry responsibility for the things that happened on their watch, whether or not the fault was entirely theirs to hold. What those 30 years of reflection have produced for a man now in his 80s is not regret in the simple sense, not a wish that Michael English had never existed, or that that voice had never found its way into the Gaither project. What it produced was something more honest than regret, a reckoning with the gap between what you can see in a person's gift and what you cannot yet see in their readiness, and the slow, irreversible understanding that those two things are not the same, and that mistaking one for the other has consequences that extend far beyond the two people sitting in the room when the decision gets made. For those of us who have followed this ministry through the decades, who watched those homecoming videos until the cassette cases wore through and the tapes needed rewinding for what felt like the 100th time, this story isn't really about scandal. It isn't really about one man's personal failures or one organization's difficult season. It's about something older and more familiar than any of that. The question Bill Gaither has carried quietly is one that anyone who has ever invested deeply in another person's potential knows from the inside. Pouring yourself into someone's gift, lifting them up, giving them every resource and every door, that act also makes you responsible in ways you don't fully understand until years later for what the exposure does to them. The platform and the person have to grow at the same rate, and when they don't, the platform doesn't simply stop growing. It becomes a weight the person wasn't built to carry yet. And the person who placed them under that weight carries something of his own. Gospel music, as a tradition, has always been more honest about human failure than most other forms. The songs themselves are built around it. The prodigal coming home, the wanderer finding the road back, the one who had nothing left discovering that grace had been there all along, waiting without conditions. Michael English's story belongs inside that tradition, not as a cautionary tale, but as a genuinely human one. And so, in his quieter way, does Bill Gaither's. Not as a man who failed, but as one who loved a young singer enough to give him everything, and who has spent the years since sorting through what that love set in motion, without the comfort of a clean answer to land on. If you've followed this ministry since the early homecoming days, you know exactly what it means when we say that the music was never separate from the people who made it. The voices and the stories were always the same thing, and they still are. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet. Michael English's situation wasn't the only time Bill Gaither had to hold together the tension between extraordinary talent and the private struggle that extraordinary talent sometimes runs alongside. The homecoming world has always gathered voices that arrived with full human histories attached, and one of the most documented of those histories belongs to Russ Taff, whose battle with alcoholism became, eventually, one of the most honest testimonies in all of contemporary Christian music. Russ Taff's voice in those homecoming recordings was the kind of sound that audiences responded to at a level below conscious preference. That unmistakable roughness at the top of his range, the way he carried a lyric like, "We will stand," as though the song were pulling something physical out of him. A quality that couldn't be manufactured because it came from somewhere real. And for years, what Russ was actually carrying never became visible to the people who loved that voice. When it did become visible, through the documentary I Still Believe, which captured both the beauty of what Russ had built and the damage that alcohol had done to his family across those same years, the gospel community had to sit with something that wasn't comfortable. The homecoming cameras had been in the room. The recordings had been made. The man singing about faith surviving hardship had been living a version of that hardship that the liner notes never mention. Bill Gaither kept Russ Taff inside the homecoming world through those years, and depending on who you ask, that decision reflects either the deep, unconditional love at the center of the Gaither theology, or the complicated question of what genuine support looks like when someone you love isn't yet ready to receive it. The honest answer is probably that it reflects both, held together without resolution, the way most real decisions made out of love tend to be held. What the handling of both Michael English and Russ Taff reveals, across the full span of the homecoming recordings, is a consistent conviction on Bill Gaither's part that restoration is always available, that the platform should be there when the person is ready to return to it, that the relationship between the organization and the artist doesn't end because one chapter ends badly. Whether that conviction always served the individuals at its center in the way Bill intended, whether it offered them the particular kind of protection they needed at the moment they needed it, is the question that lives in the careful pauses, the measured silences, the moments when Bill chooses his words about a specific chapter of the band's history with a deliberateness that communicates more than the words themselves carry. That question hasn't been answered publicly. And for the audience that has been inside this ministry for 40 years or more, the fact that it hasn't been answered is not frustrating. It's the most honest thing about the whole story. What happens next with Michael English's place in the Gaither legacy and what Bill Gaither says about it in the years remaining to him is something the gospel community will watch with genuine attention. A conversation still hasn't fully happened in public about timing, about responsibility, about the distance between a person's gift and their readiness to carry what comes with it. Those questions are still open, and they don't look like they're closing anytime soon. Whatever chapter comes next for Bill Gaither and the family of voices he built his life around, the people who have followed this ministry through decades of recordings and homecoming gatherings and late nights watching those videos know one thing with certainty. His story isn't finished. And neither is the conversation he started, whether he intended to or not. Every time he pauses just slightly too long before answering a particular question about a particular name. If this story stayed with you today, the next video in this series carries the same weight. We've been tracing the untold chapter of Russ Taff's years inside the Gaither organization, and what came out of that research brought some answers that even the people who knew him best weren't prepared to hear.